Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today on Custom Business Central Reporting. Joining us today is Chad Williams from Innovia Consulting. And before I pass it over to Chad, I would like to remind you that this session is being recorded and it will be posted to our on-demand webinar library later this week for you to review and share with anyone. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to type those into the questions box. We will get them answered at the end of the presentation. And so now I will pass it on to Chad to begin our presentation.
All right, thank you, Angie, and thank you everyone for taking some time this afternoon. Again, as Angie said, if I can get this to advance, there it goes. My name is Chad Williams. I'm our COO. I lead our NAV delivery team. My background is software development, software engineering. I started with Innovia and with NAV a little over 15 years ago. Did a lot of work earlier in that time in development and still stay pretty close to it, even though I am now in a leadership position. So today we are going to talk about custom reporting in Business Central. So a couple of things that I want to make sure that we cover today is, first of all, I'm going to talk about the differences really between Business Central on-prem or NAV and Business Central SaaS. So I'm going to talk about some of the naming there and try to explain what those differences are that are ultimately driving the changes that we are seeing now in terms of how we might access data and how we do our reports. So once we've gone through that, I will talk about different options that we have. So whether that's reporting or just general data access with Business Central. And then finally, I'll switch over into demo mode and walk you through kind of an example of how to migrate your NAV reports from your current environment to Business Central. So starting off, excuse me, really to talk about the architecture. Again, we have to understand the architecture first, as that is driving the changes. So Microsoft has two variations of Business Central right now that you can run. The first being the on-premise, which is really nothing more than NAV as we have always remembered it to be. Had they not rebranded Business Central on-prem that was released in October-ish in the fall, would have been released with the name NAV 2019. So it is essentially NAV 2019. Business Central hosted or software as a service is at the heart the exact same application. It is still NAV 2019. It is just hosted by Microsoft, and they take care of the backend servers. So your on-premise installations, whether that is physically sitting on hardware in your building, or whether that is on a VM in Azure, that is one model. And then the other model is the software as a service, which again, Microsoft is managing those servers. So what does that really mean? So much like your Office 365, where you just work with the application and you don't have to worry about the backend Exchange servers and everything else that goes along with it, the same is now with Business Central SaaS. So Microsoft manages the backend servers, excuse me. However, because they're doing that, it now limits the access that we have. And so we are used to being able to get to the SQL Server when we're running on premise. When you're on SaaS, that is no longer an option. So I have no direct access to the SQL database. And that is really the driving change here that we're going to be talking about today. My data access now in the new SaaS model is really limited to the clients, whether that's my web client or my phone or tablet clients, or through web services. So as we go through this, you'll see web services are really where I can get that data out now in the future. So because the diagram always shows a lot more than words, what we have here is kind of a quick overview of what the server, the installation environment looks like. So everything that you see down here at the bottom in gray is what Microsoft is now managing. So you have your web server, IIS components for your web client and your tablet or phone app. You have the server, which this is really the Microsoft, the Navision service tier if you're used to the architecture currently. This is where then the IIS connects to your SOAP and data web services, the development environment, which I'll come back to, and then your administration tools. So then you see even further removed from that, down here at the bottom is the SQL Server database components, which again, Microsoft is managing, and there is no direct connection to that now. So I want to talk a little bit about this AL development environment, because the way this diagram was put together, this is a little misleading in that this to me might make me think I can access it directly and modify it. That is not necessarily true. I still have my ability to modify, but it's through extensions and apps rather than modifying objects directly. So if you're used to developing in the current versions of NAV 2018 and before, you know that you connect with the development environment to the actual database and you modify the objects in the database. You no longer do that in this environment, and we're going to talk about that in a second here. So, so this is the topology of the install, and everything in the lower gray box in the SaaS model, again, is managed by Microsoft. So let's talk about the development side of this, because it's not just about whether I am running on-premise or on SaaS. It's also about the changes that are coming, or that have already come for that matter, in way of how the modifications are done. So as I said earlier, we no longer modify the database directly. And this comes for a variety of reasons, if nothing else, just to make upgrades and things in the future easier. So when we are modifying the base application directly, the benefit is it gives us a lot of power. We can do a lot of different things. The downside of it is, I'm sure any of you have seen, especially anybody that's been through an upgrade, is that those can be very time consuming and very expensive. So the answer to this, Microsoft has come to the table with extensions. So extensions are how we modify the Business Central SaaS application only, as you can see here. So on the SaaS version, we can do extensions only. So it's only the new way. The CAL code has been converted to AL code, so there's a new development environment, there's a new language, looks a lot like the old one, and it's all done that way. So this is a whole nother topic that I am not going to get into today, because it's a whole nother session that I could go through. So I'm just kind of giving you an overview of this, but I'm going to build on some assumptions that you have some background knowledge to extensions and AL development. And again, just to reiterate, so on the SaaS version, I can do extensions only. If I'm running on-premise with the current version with BC on-prem, I can still do both. So the reason I want to call this out is this is really the platform to get to move to the future, to move forward with NAV and Business Central. So whether you want to go to Business Central SaaS or not, you still need to get your modifications moved over to AL and to extensions. At some point, Microsoft is going to retire the classic development environment, in which case you will have no other option but to go through this. So on-premise right now, again, you have the option to run both, and this works very well because it allows you to kind of transition your modifications from CAL, from the classic development to AL. But again, just keep in mind, that's for now. At some point in the next year or two, Microsoft has said that will go away. Excuse me. So what are our options? So from a reporting standpoint, what options do we have to bring our reports forward? So first of all, I want to call it the reports are the same. There's a couple minor differences. Obviously, we went from CAL to AL, but the layout, the meat of the report is still based on report definition language, or RDLC. It's still based on the same engine that reporting services uses. So if you're familiar with how NAV reports are today, you know you have a data set that's defined within NAV, within the object designer. within the classic development environment. You also have the layout of the report, the visual aspect of the report. When you design that visual aspect of the report, it opens Visual Studio or it opens Report Builder. You make your changes and bring it back in. That part of it is still the same. The data set side of it is what has changed, and that's because of this conversion from the CAL language to the AL language. So Microsoft has made some changes there, and that's part of what I'll show you when I go through the conversion here. The other thing to keep in mind that BC is nav, and it's still the same. Now the clients are different. So if you've been on nav for a while and you've gone through the transition from classic client to RTC client, there were big differences, right, in terms of how the clients looked and how they behaved. But behind the scenes, underneath the hood, a lot of the code was the same. The same exists here. So all of the code that was in NAV 2018 is in BC. It's just the look and feel of it has changed and brought about some differences. So there is a spot for your reports. There is life for them in the future. They do not have to be completely rewritten. I think what I'm going to show you here in a little bit, if you went through that transition from classic to RTC, you will see it is much simpler than what we went through then. So then just to speak about other options, again, because we have no direct SQL access, now there are probably some of you are going, okay, reports, that's great, I get it, but I have a ton of things that I am doing directly against the database. What am I going to do about all of this? So again, because there is no direct SQL access, we really have to look at web services at this point to pull data out of the system. So we have web services that can be brought into Power BI or Excel. There's a lot of other tools out there. There's many third-party tools that will work with web services that can work with OData and bring that data in. So this is not a Microsoft Business Central thing. This is a widely used technology, and there are many tools out there that can consume data from an OData web service and bring that out to you. Now, those of you that are running SQL reporting services, so over the years, we have built many SQL reporting services reports. I'm talking about reports not built within NAV, written with regular SQL reporting services. We've got them deployed on a report server. We're not writing CAL code and building data sets in NAV. We're writing select statements or stored procedures or views with Transact SQL and pulling that data into these reports. So at this point in time, I have not found a good solution to being able to connect to OData with SQL reporting services. Out of the box, it does not connect, or it does not support a data source for OData. I've checked periodically over the last few months. I have not seen any really good third-party applications out there that stand out that might bring this to the table, but I suspect there's likely some out there. So depending on the data you're using, this is going to be a little bit of a hurdle for you if you've made a large investment into SQL reporting services and you're dependent on that direct SQL access. So I think one of the first places to look is, can you do a data warehouse? So I can use tools to pull data from the OData web services, replicate the BC data into a data warehouse, and then I can point my reports and rewrite the queries that I need to pull the data out of the data warehouse. So that's one option in terms of how you could do that. Now, obviously, depending on if it's real-time data that you've got or if it's more historical reporting, that can create different challenges as well. The other thing that I have seen, I've done some tests with it. I have not fully validated it, but again, the NAV reports are built with the same layouts as your SQL reporting services reports. So I think there is a lot of that you can reuse if you decided to take those reporting services reports and pull them into NAV. The layouts should largely be reusable, and then you would have to build the data set. So you'd have to build the data set within NAV, wire it up to your layout, and then as I'll say in theory, there should be some work that you can salvage or rework there if you choose to go that route. So that, again, if you have a heavy investment in SQL reporting services, that might be another route to look at if you're thinking about just pulling the reports you need into Business Central. There are also many ISVs out there, so I'm not going to turn this into a specific plug for any one ISV. There are many that we work with. Certainly there's Jet, we've worked with 4Nav, and then there's E1. Smart Lists are just a few that I would mention. If you get out there and look at the different ISVs, look at who's offering report options, there are many out there. There are many folks that when we got to the classic RTC kind of transformation days when the 2009 came out, a lot of folks at that time decided, I'm tired of having to deal with however Microsoft decides to change the reporting, and they pulled it off into some of these tools. So certainly if you're in that spot where you think you just want to kind of pull some of those reports out of out of Business Central, you can certainly do that and look into some of those ISVs that are out there. And then finally, I'll mention here, I'm just going to mention the Common Data Service. So this is a platform that Microsoft is working on. I can see where they're heading with it. I don't think it is fully there yet, but basically the idea is to kind of standardize your data between different applications. So a customer is a customer, and it's always a customer. It has a name, it has an address, those types of things, to make data more consumable across different applications. So in my mind, I start to theorize, well, what is this going to mean for reporting down the road? Because it's not too far fetched to think that at some point this may change, or may add, I should say, add to what we have in terms of reporting capabilities in the future. So just going to mention that quickly, that I see that as something down the road, but I don't know that it's fully there yet. So let's talk about how we actually would migrate your reports. So again, the focus here is going to be how do you get those NAV reports to Business Central. So you're typically going to be doing this as part of an upgrade. So you're going to upgrade from your current version to Business Central on-premise. Upgrading to that version is really the stepping stone to where you want to go in the future. Whether you want to remain on-premise or if you want to go to Business Central SaaS, the jumping point up to Business Central SaaS is BC on-prem. And then in terms of reworking your modifications from CAL to AL and to extensions, this is really, at this point in time, is the best platform to do that. Because I can run in kind of that mixed mode and work my modifications over as I can, or kind of at my pace, and I don't have to kind of make a all or nothing jump. So you're really going to be doing this as part of an upgrade. So if you're working with a partner, or whether you're doing this on your own, what we will do is we will typically do an upgrade of the database. So we will merge over changes, all of your modifications, we'll upgrade the data, and then we get a test database. And it's really at this point that you would then start looking at your reports and what you're going to do with them. So you're not live yet on Business Central on-prem. You're now working through the project. So now you can go through and identify those reports and start to work with this conversion process. So there is a tool to help with this, and this I'm going to show in my demo here in a minute. There is a tool, basically two tools that work together. One is just the command line capability of the dev client that we have always had, along with some new features that Microsoft has added to support this. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the object, the report that I want to work with, and I'm going to export it using this tool. Then there is a secondary tool that will convert it from CAL to AL. So this kind of helps in the process of getting my code from the old to the new. And it does a pretty good job from what I've seen and from what I've heard from our developers. Unlike, again, I hate to keep going back to the dark days of the RTC transformations, but unlike those days where there were some utilities out there to help, a lot of stuff just required basically being rebuilt from the ground up. In this case, these utilities, the change is less drastic. So these utilities can do a lot more in terms of helping us do that. So once I've exported the report that I want to work with, I'm going to convert it over to AL, and then now I've got to put it into an extension. So again, I can't just modify the object in the database. I can't access it directly, so I've got to get it into an extension, and I will do that in my demo, and then finally I have to deploy it up to the server so I can see the report. So let's jump into the demo here. So I'm going to just quickly here what I'm going to cover. So I'm going to talk about the report conversion. I'm going to talk about the designing of the report layout, and then show you a few things about how to actually access it from the client. So let me see if I can get out of here. And then I'm just going to switch over to my environment here. And Angie, I don't know if you're there, but could you just confirm that you can see Business Central now and not the PowerPoint?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what I have here is basically just a Kronos kind of sandbox demo environment of Business Central. I believe this happens to be just the RTM, or the release to market version that came out last fall. It does not include any cumulative updates, but for the extent of our demo here today, this will work just fine. So what I'm going to do here is I want to change a stock report. I don't have any custom objects in this database, but what I'm going to do is just pick on the customer top 10 list report. And so I'm just going to run this, and anybody that's been on nav for a while has probably seen this very basic report. It's probably one of the simplest ones in the system. Showing up at the top here, my top 10 customers ranked by sales, and then a nice little bar graph down here. So this is a stock report. This happens to be report number 111. And so what I want to do is I want to make a few changes to this. And so one thing here that's very important to note is that there are some limitations on what objects I can modify through extensions. So when it comes to a report, I can only create new reports. I have no ability to modify this report to actually go to report 111 and change it. So the only thing I can do is copy the stock report to a custom range, to a custom number, to 50,000 range, for example, give the report a new name, and then I can do whatever I want with it. So just an important thing to call out here, that I cannot do that with extensions. There are limitations. The same exists for code units. I cannot directly modify a code unit. Instead, I have events that I can subscribe to use to modify the functionality that I want. So I'm not going to dive into that, because again, that's a whole another topic, but just in terms of reports, keep in mind that if you're going to modify a stock report, you have to make a copy of it and then modify the copy. And for many folks, that's long time, has been their best practice. Everybody's kind of got their different approach to it, but there are many people out there that over the years have done the same. Even in the old environment, if they were going to modify a stock report, they would make a copy of it and modify that. I don't necessarily 100% subscribe to that idea, because I think there's other issues that creates in an upgrade. But that's really what you have to do going forward. So let's jump into it here. I'm just going to switch something on my other screen. So let's talk about how we go about getting this report. So I'm going to just for a second here jump over to the development environment. So this is the report that I want to look at. So I've got report 111, and so normally if I were going to work with this report, I could export it, or I could design it here, and obviously that is no longer the case. So as I said earlier, I have got basically a two-step process to be able to start working with this report. One, I need to export it as text in a new format, and then I also need to convert it to AL. So I still have my ability to export and import objects here. This is the Business Central development environment. It is basically the same as it was in 2018. However, if I just go in here and export this object as text, it's not going to be in quite the right format that the conversion tool needs it to be in. And to be honest with you, I haven't exported both ways and done a comparison. They must be subtle because to the naked eye, they look basically the same. So I'm just going to minimize the development environment here for a second. Move this down. And so I have a command prompt open. So I'm going to do both of these just through command line. I could also do it in PowerShell, but for today I'm just going to do it with the command prompt. And I've got a folder over here at the right that I'm just going to minimize this one that I just want to call out. So whenever I do this, I will create a working directory for the files that I need to work with. So have two folders here. One I have just named CAL and the other one AL. So what I'm going to do is the first step of the process is going to export the object as text in CAL. And then the second utility is going to convert it from CAL to AL. So as we go through this, you'll be able to see the files get created in these folders. So right now, I'm going to start with exporting the CAL. So you can see I've got nothing in here. So I'm just going to hop over to my command prompt and find my command. So I've already run these and cleared everything out just to save on copy and pasting and having to type all of this in. So I'll talk through this command. So again, this is just the finsql.exe. So if you've worked with these in the past, there's a lot of different things you can do command line with the executable for the dev client. So here I have to specify a command. So this is called export to new syntax. So this will export it as text, but to this quote unquote new syntax that I'm not actually clear what the differences are between the new and the old, but it's what is required for the text to AL tool that I'm going to show next. So then I give it a file name on where I'm going to save it. So I'm going to save it to my CAL folder here. I'm just going to call it 111.txt. Much like when I connect with the dev client, I got to connect to a database in a server. So I've got my SQL server and my database name here. And then finally, I can specify a filter for what objects I want to export. So if I wanted to dump all reports out of the database, I could just set a filter of type equal to report and drop the ID off. So, but in this case, I want to just pull report 111. So I'm going to run this. And now you can see over on the right, I have my file. So I'm just going to open this up. And again, for anybody that's used to looking at these object files in text, there's not too much different about them. So one thing I want to call out here at this point. So again, depending on the licensing you have, for many of you, you might be going, hey, I don't have the ability to export to text. So you do have to have the development license to do some of this, to be able to export some of these objects to text. So just to call that out. So I'm going to switch over here on the right. I'm going to go into my AL folder. I've got nothing there. And I'm going to switch to my other command. So the other utility that comes with this, and again, this sits with the Rolltailor client install. So it sits in the same folder as where finsql.exe is, where the development environment is. It'll install when you install it, is this text to AL. And this simple little utility will just take a source and a target. So the source being my AL folder, and the output being, or excuse me, my CAL folder, and then my target or output being the AL folder. So I am going to run this. Oh, enter. Okay, so it'll give me a little bit of feedback here. It can see that it created 2 files in the AL folder, and there are no errors. So you'll see over here on the right, however, we've got a bunch of other files. So these files at the bottom here, these XLF, these are basically translation files used for multi-language. Microsoft has split out how it handles some of that. that's yet another topic that I could dive way off into, so I'm just going to basically ignore those for now. And really what I want to focus in on are these two files that it created. So it created a report.al file. So this is the file that has now been converted over to AL, and then it has created an RDLC file. So instead of everything being in one file, it is now separated the report and pulled out the layout part of the report into its own file, and then the data set, the rest of the object definition, the properties, any code that's in the report is all in this AL file. And it has been converted from CAL to AL, all for me by that utility. So I'm going to take these two files. I'm just going to copy these. And what I've got here is this other folder here I'm going to paste these into. And so what I've got here is basically the starting point of a new extension. So I've already created an empty extension that I'm going to use. Again, for the scope of today's call, I can't go into all of the detail in terms of how I built the base extension, but it is very simple to do. And actually, if you've got started with some of the AL development, there are many guides out there, and there's actually a script that you can run that will just create basically the same template that you can start working with. So before I switch over to VS Code, I'm going to do a couple things with these files. So as you may know, if you've ever renumbered an object in nav, currently I can't have objects with duplicate IDs, and they have to have different names. So just to keep my file naming consistent with the naming of my objects, I'm just going to renumber the report to 50,100, and then I'm going to throw a name in front of my report demo. I'm going to do the same on the RDLC file. I'm going to put demo in front of the name. And then one other thing I like to do is I'm just going to drop the C off of the extension. So it was RDLC, I'm going to just change it to RDL. And the only benefit that I get from that is just, so this is also our environment where we do our development work. We've got multiple versions of Visual Studio. We've got Report Builder. So by renaming that to RDL, it just will associate the file with Report Builder without making other changes. It just makes it a little easier to open up and work with that file going forward. And I'll show you that in a little bit. So I am now going to switch over to Visual Studio Code. So this is if you haven't seen it yet, this is the new development environment. Visual Studio Code's been around for a number of years. It has very quickly become one of the most popular development environments out there. It's not just a development environment for nav. Basically, much like I would modify Business Central with an extension, I can install extensions into VS Code that will tell VS Code how to interpret the nav specific files like an AL file, and then it will know how to read and compile that and know how to build my extension and my app that I'll publish to the server. So again, this is basically the layout of an empty extension. It has two folders in it, one called AL Packages, the other one called VS Code. The AL Packages has a few files in here. There could be more, and I'll talk about that after the demo. Basically, what these are extension files or app files that explain to Visual Studio Code what the base application looks like. Without these files, it won't know what a customer is or what an item is or what fields are in an item or a customer. It won't know what the sales posting code unit is, and it won't know what events are available there. So these tell the extension what the base code application looks like. Then there are two setting files or JSON files. One's called launch. That's just used for the deployment and testing, as you'll see here in a minute as I run this. And then the other is called an app.json, which just gives it the definition. It's kind of a signature file that tells, what's the app, who's the publisher. It gives the app has a unique ID. There can be a link to a logo, as we've got here, different things. So again, just a quick overview of what's in here. The focus here is really now on these two files that I copied in. So if I click on these, they'll open. So I'm just going to start on this RDLC file. If you've ever looked at reporting services report, if you ever looked at the contents of that file, it is just an XML file. And so again, this RDL file is just the SQL side, the layout side of the report. It defines where all the fields are, it defines the tables, and anything else on the actual layout of the report. So in here, this is, not that you can't edit this file directly in here. It's just very difficult, and there are better tools for that. So I will open this in Report Builder in a little bit, but there's a couple things I want to show you first. So let's open up the AL file, because that's where the differences are. So this is AL. So if you're used to writing code in CAL, a lot of this will look the same. A lot of the base syntax, here's an assignment, if else begin statements are all the same. None of that has changed. So if you're used to writing code in CLL and CAL and the basic syntax, there's not, the meat of this has not changed. There's a few changes in terms of how it's defined, obviously, because it's a different environment. I'm not opening the designer anymore in Visual or in the development environment. I'm now opening it in here. So it's more, it's just a little different. One of the things that I like is, this is a tool used widely by software developers. I can have snippets. So, for us, many of us that have written code only in the nav development environment, we've been, we've kind of been without some of these tools that many people have had in the software development world for many, many years. And so now I have kind of that full power here. I can do snippets, IntelliSense, all of these different things. Now, Microsoft added some of those to the later versions, but it is nothing like what I would have inside of here. So there's a few changes that I need to make to this file, but basically this is just the data set part of the report. So here you can see a tag for the data set. So I can see some code in here. I can see my data item. I can see the different columns. The request page is in here. So again, it's everything that was in the report except for the layout. The layout was removed and it was put into the RDLC file, or the RDL file. So if I go up to the top here, again, as I said earlier, I need to give this report a unique name and ID. I changed the file names. That was just for my reference. That doesn't necessarily communicate to the extension what the ID is. So I have to change it here to 50,100. And then again, I'm just going to, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to prefix the report name with demo. So at the top here, there's a couple other properties that are important. So I have to tell it what the RDLC file or the RDL file is. It doesn't matter, again, the fact that it's an RDLC or RDL file, it does not matter. It will consume either. They're the same. So I just have to, I have to just give it the path of the file. So because I renamed it, I just have to do the same here, and then I'm just going to drop my C. So there has to be a reference to this other file so it knows what it's looking for. I'm going to comment out 2 lines here, this application area property in this usage category. And I'll come back to that in just a couple minutes, because this is something that can cause you a lot of grief if you don't pay attention to those properties. And then finally, I'm just going to change my caption as well so it stands out. So at this point, I can save this file, and then a quick Control F5 will build the application. So you can see here, if you saw this APP file just pop in, this is the actual extension file. This is the file that I could take to another Business Central tenant, install it, and deploy it. So what it's doing in the behind the scenes there is it built the APP file, and it then published it to my Business Central tenant. And then for convenience in the development environment here is it'll pop open Business Central. I can also specify in that launch.json file what object I type an ID to open. So if I were working with the report and making changes back and forth, I can put that in there, and then that way each time it'll just open up the report. So I want to show here now. So I'm going to search for my customer top report, and you'll notice something here that I only have the one. So my new demo report isn't showing up. And the reason for that are those two properties that I commented out. So I wanted to do this way to just raise the point here that these two properties control whether I can find them in the search. And depending on the report you're working with, they may or may not show up here. So this report had these properties specified when I copied it. If they weren't in that base report, then these properties wouldn't have shown here. And then if I don't know about these, so I've spent a lot of time, I've gotten very frustrated because I've forgotten these simple properties. And in the earlier releases, we've been working with Business Central since it first came out over a year ago. And I can tell you in some of those early versions, even some of this was buggy. So just keep in mind that whenever you are adding something in an extension, if you can't find it, it's likely because you don't have these properties in here. So I'm just going to change this. So for this application area, I usually just put all in here. And then for the usage category, this is just going to be reports and analysis as it is already. So now I'm going to hit a Control F5. It's going to rebuild the app. It's going to republish it back up to the server. And then it should pop back open here. There it goes. So now it's opening Business Central again. And so now if I go to my little light bulb up here, my search, and I do a customer top 10. So now you can see I've got both reports, the stock report and my demo. So if I click on the demo, I just preview this, you'll see that, ta-da, it's the same as it was before. So now I've got something that I can modify. So I've shown you how to convert it, to make a copy of it, convert it, and get it over here. But okay, so now it's time to actually do something to this. So I'm just going to make a simple change to this report. I'm going to open it up, design the layout, and then I'm just going to change the color of the bar graph down here. So let me minimize this. I'm going to minimize Visual Studio Code because, again, I don't want to work. It's certainly possible to go in and edit the XML. I would not recommend that. So I'm just going to close that. I'm going to minimize this. And so I'm just going to go back to my working folder here where I renamed the file. I'm just going to double click on it because it's already associated with Report Builder. I've got that installed on here, so you will need Report Builder. So that pops open so you can see here's my layout. So again, if you're used to designing the layouts in Nav today, this is all the same. Nothing has changed here. So I'm just going to go down here, click on my bar chart, select my series, and jump into the series properties, go to the fill, and I'm just going to change the color from automatic to, we'll just select a green here or something. Hit OK. Now I'm just going to hit save and close this out. So now I'm going to go back to Visual Studio. I could leave that open as long as I saved it. I can go back over here because now I have to recompile and redeploy the extension to see my changes. So again, I just switched back to Visual Studio Code, quick Control F5, and it's compiling. And then it's going to send the updated extension to the server, republish it, and in a few moments, it should pop open the client again. I'm going to go up to my search, customer, and so I'm going to run my report. Preview it, and you'll see I've now got my different green color. So again, I could make a lot of other changes, but just in the interest of time, just wanted to show you how you would then open up the layout and modify it. So it's, all in all, it's not too bad. The one thing I would call the big thing that I see that's different between the changes that we need to deal with here now and what we had to do with reports when the Rolltailor client or the RTC client came out is that when the RTC client came out, the layout was different. It changed from the old NAV classic report to the RDLC report. And that's where a lot of the pain was in rebuilding the report. And in a lot of cases, it was rebuilding the report from scratch. There were utilities, there still are utilities out there that could convert some of these. And, depending on the report, sometimes it worked very well. Others was very challenging, especially the document reports. In this case, it's really the data set of the report that has changed. Again, the file in here in VS Code, it's just this that has changed. The layout has stayed the same. This side of the report is much easier to work with, and there's just not a lot to deal with there. So that layout stayed the same, and so really for that reason, this isn't too bad, and you could do many of these at the same time. So in this example, I made a copy of a stock report because I wanted to show you how you would modify a stock report. But if you had a custom report 50,100, you would go through the same steps to then bring it forward. You would export it using the new syntax, you would convert it text AL, and then you would come in here, fix any issues that came up. Again, there might be a few in here, but for the most part, I've not seen many. And then, you simply publish it. So I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint and we'll start wrapping up here. Let me get this back in presentation mode. And so there's one thing here that I want to call out. One of the things you have to consider is the data that you're working with. So typically when we're modifying a report, it's because we want to add custom fields that we've added to our database. So if I've added a new attribute type field to an item table, or if I've added something to the sales line table, typically when we're changing the report, it's to now expose those new fields that we've added to the report. So what you have to consider here is that when I build an extension, so I started to talk about those symbol files, those two files, the APP files that I talked about that told Visual Studio or told my extension what the base application looked like. So so what I was working with knew what an item was. It knew what a customer is. Now those files that I downloaded from the server only contain the stock objects. So if I made changes to an item and I added fields to it, it would not know about those fields. So I have really two options. So one, and it really is going to depend on how I am going through this, but I either have to have those fields in those symbol files for the base application, or I have to have those changes within the scope of my extension, or they have to be in another extension that my extension is dependent on. So when you start to go down this path of converting your mods, one of the first design questions or architectural questions you're going to have to answer is, how do I want to approach this? Do I want to build all of my modifications into one big extension, or do I want to try to separate them out? And I think the answer to that is going to be different for everybody, and it's going to depend on the situation that you've got. And then there's, of course, variations of how you might break it up. In general, isolation and separating your changes is the best practice. Depending on what you've got, that might be very difficult to do. So just keep in mind that if I'm trying to work with a report, I need to know about any custom data that I'm working with. And if those custom fields are in the database and they exist as CAL modifications, as old modifications, when I download the symbols file, they're going to come along with it because it doesn't know the difference between what was stock and what wasn't. It just looks at the database and says, give me all the code that's in the database. So if your modifications are still in the database, they'll be in those symbol files. So that's helpful as you transition and work through this process of moving your mods to AL and extensions. If you've already built an extension that has those fields for the item table, for example, you just have to add a dependency to your extension, from your report extension to the extension that has the table in it. The last option is that I made the changes to the table actually within my extension, and then it will know about those changes. So that's just something to keep in mind as you go through this. So kind of to wrap this up here, so key takeaways. So again, the big difference with Business Central SaaS, no direct SQL. So again, if you've made a big investment into either reports or integrations where you're doing direct SQL access, if you're going to go to Business Central SaaS, you're going to have to look at other options there, and you're probably going to want to look to web services first. Keep in mind, however, you can run on-premise yet. So if you have a lot of that, this might be a reason for you to stay on-premise. And if you have a lot of other applications that you're integrating with, getting to SaaS might be, is going to be difficult because of these reasons. And if you have a lot of other applications, that just might not be worth it to you to do that. So just keep in mind that no direct SQL access on Business Central SaaS is the first thing you've got. And then of course you've got to work through moving your modifications from CAL to AL. And again, Business Central on-premise is really the platform to do that. So whether you decide to upgrade and go live on Business Central on-premise, you can do that without reworking your mods to extensions yet, because you can still run the old way, if you will, and then you can transition over time working your mods over to extensions. So you can go live on Business Central on premise, or you can start working towards it, get your mods rewritten, and then go live with the whole thing. So you've got some options, and you've got options in terms of data access. So again, there's the ISVs that are out there. There's many utilities out there that will work with web services to consume that data. And then finally, as I've shown here, there is a future for those existing reports, and it's not there's effort there, but it's not like what some of us might have faced when converting to the RTC. So with that, I have a few suggested resources here that I would just like to share. There's some, this top link just as a good example goes through probably in a little bit more detail than I did here today on how to convert your reports to AL. The second link here is just on this text to AL tool, so just Microsoft's documentation on that. Some information on how to create an RDL layout. So if you're not familiar with that, if you're new to BC, this can help you understand that aspect of it. If you're going to work with web services and you want to pull data out using them, really the object you're going to want to know about or learn about, if you don't already, is the query object. Query objects can be used to query, as the name suggests, data out of the database, and then those can be exposed as web service endpoints so that you can get that data through OData. So there's just a link on that. And then finally, this is talking about the searching that I showed there, where the report did not show up in the search. So this talks about how to add pages and reports to the search. So with that, I will open it up to any questions.
Thank you very much, Chad, for the presentation. It appears that we do not have any questions for you today. So if anybody does have any, please feel free to contact us. We would love to discuss your questions in more detail. And I just had a quick question, Chad. Those suggested links that you have, is it possible to get those to share with the attendees?
Yes. Yeah. If we can send out, I'm fine if we can send out the PowerPoint if that's easiest, or however we would do that. But we can certainly share those.
Yeah, we
because
can do
I'm
that.
sure nobody wrote them down that quickly. So yeah, we'll
No.
make sure that anybody can get access to them.
Okay, we will send everyone a PowerPoint link with those suggested sites that Chad was discussing. All right, well, thank you, Chad, for the presentation today, and to everyone on today's call, or if you are watching on demand, thank you for joining us. And we do have a few more webinars coming soon. On March 19th, we have Naveen Reddy from Dynamics eShop, and he will be presenting on traffic engagement and conversions. Set up a successful B2C store with eShop. And then we have Mike Busolari from True Commerce, and he will be presenting on Ready to Do Business in Every Direction. That webinar will be on Wednesday, March 20th. And Innovia will be having our annual customer conference coming up on April 24th and 25th in the Wisconsin Dells. The customer conference is a great event where you can network and learn the latest of your NAV Business Central system from the Innovia team, our Microsoft representative, and our ISV partners. So contact your rep or visit our conference page. That's innovia.com/conferences, and it'll have all the details for you there about our conference. This is a free event to attend. We would love to have you. Register now. Hotel rooms are going fast. All right, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on another Innovia webinar. Have a great day, everyone.